Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome again to another episode of Pilgrims on the Digital Way. My name is Matt Poynton, and with me today, as always, is.
Hi, I'm Mary Michelle, and welcome to this episode, everyone. Hi, Matt.
Hello. So last week we talked about whether you could kind of make up your own pilgrimage or, put one together yourself. I haven't seen any comments on there. Do you have any comments that you've heard or that you want to give yourself, Mary Michelle?
Not that I've seen Matt. Um, I think I don't know if it's about so much about making it ourselves as having creating something very, very personal, probably for a very personal reason. And so all I want to add to that, Matt, is that because we've continued, Matt and I talk about this during the week too, and I continue to search for really some broader, more general, but also some more specific ways of looking at what it means to be a pilgrim, and what a pilgrimage, how we can define it right now in the 21st century, which of course is different from
Mm-hmm.
um, previous times. So what I've noticed is that there's a very distinct thing. So we either do it what I would call solo, which is what people are doing on the Camino. Now they're not necessarily by themselves, although some people are, but they're in their own little group or with their spouse or friend or
Mm-hmm.
family, or so I'm calling that solo, as opposed to other pilgrimages where we know that hundreds, sometimes thousands of people will gather to walk together, usually a shorter distance, although it can be over several days, also considered a pilgrimage.
Mm-hmm.
But then, so what I'm seeing, Matt, all I'm trying to say is I'm seeing that there are different types, like that second one I just said, so that we can arrive at some different definitions and understandings. Because that one, for example, is in a very specific religious context,
Yeah,
uh,
I think, I mean,
where the Camino is not.
yeah, well, when you talk about that, so I have a friend who is he's a traditionalist Catholic. So they're the kind of ones that they only go to mass in Latin, and they
Oh
don't
yeah,
really like the Vatican II stuff and that.
integrationists they're called. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, he's very dedicated. And like when we used to go to the pub, he would go to the corner at certain times and pray in Latin. And but he would go on an annual pilgrimage. In fact, I think he did two, but he certainly did one every year where they went from Paris to Chartres in France. And it was basically like all these traditionalist Catholics got together and marched there with banners.
Yeah.
Um, and the thing is, like he got something out of it, but it seemed to be very different in nature from what the Camino type experience is.
This is what I'm saying. This is quite
It, so
entirely different.
I would say like a Camino type experience is this voyage of discovering yourself. Whereas that seemed to be more about being part of a group and feeling belonging. And my day job, as you know, is I'm a trade unionist. And I see in the
Yeah,
trade
I was
union
going to say,
movement is when people go on like a lot of you love to go on like marches with banners and
yeah,
stuff.
and wave a banner. So it
And
was like
and
a popularity rally.
they're not there to discover something about themselves. They're there to be part of
Ah,
a group that has a shared value and a shared
interesting.
belief system, which I think
Yeah.
is very similar to my friend's Paris to Chartres pilgrimage. Whether I would call it a pilgrimage, I don't know. But then maybe that's just me being a bit arrogant.
Well, I hear that's a really good comment, Matt. Now I'm sure, are convinced that they're on a pilgrimage. The
Yeah.
fact that, it looks different to you, that's very interesting because, as we're looking at definitions, we're also looking at
Mm.
perceptions. So that's
Well,
very interesting, Matt.
yeah, I literally am reading a work at the moment by a lady, a young lady. She died in 1943, I think, called Simone Weil. She was a French philosopher. She was Jewish born,
She
but a
was
very a
Jewish.
mystic.
Yes.
And she actually had a religious experience in Assisi. But anyway, she writes that when you're in a crowd, you can never truly be humble, which I thought that's quite interesting.
Okay.
Okay, because you're you're bigged up by the crowd. You're part of this group. So to be humble, you need to
I
be alone. She's saying. I don't know. You don't have to agree with me.
depending on what the crowd is about, I guess. Yes.
Mm. Anyway, what's the question for today?
Okay. Okay. Well, hold on one sec. Okay. Um, so Matt, our question for today is, what about religious experiences on pilgrimages?
Okay.
So,
Hmm. Okay. So I guess before I start talking, there should be like a bit of a definition about what a religious experience is, and to
yeah,
me,
or a spiritual experience,
yeah,
we're careful about wording for sure.
yeah, I think it's where you're taken out of the ordinary, like something out of the ordinary happens. So, it could be something like Lourdes or Fatima, where people see a vision, or it could be something. It's just where you go out of the usual. So, for example, there was a very famous English pilgrim in the Middle Ages called Marjorie. Um,
Yes, starts with a
Marjorie
K.
Kemp.
Yeah,
Marjorie Kemp. Yeah, she
yeah,
came from King's Lynn, and she would burst into tears uncontrollably in churches with this
yes.
massive degree of passion for God. And I'm reading a book on Christian mysticism at the moment, and there was one in there, and I've forgotten the name, but she describes everything in almost sexual terms, like this intense love, and she had these experiences, But I mean, Francis of Assisi, the Stigmata on Mount Verna. And of course, more recently, Pedro Pio and others. So that's what I'm saying about religious experience. So that's my first thing. The second thing, have I had any? Yes. I have had religious experiences of different degrees of intensity, and the most intense ones were on pilgrimage. And I also have a little story about religious experience, not mine, that I think is worth sharing.
Okay,
So,
Matt. Well, I'm hoping we're going to get some comments on this because this is really quite interesting. And
mhm,
I'm wondering if there's, is there a gray area? Not really. I think sometimes people question if they've actually had a spiritual
mhm,
experience. Um, but what I would say to that is just, if you think it was, just trust it and go with that and write about
mhm.
it. And as you say, there's something that you're going to add at the end here that I think is important, Matt. So I think that's great. If you have a story, Matt, go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, I have several, and I think my first one was I went. It wasn't my first pilgrimage, but my first kind of long pilgrimage was I went in Wales and I walked to a place called Bardsey Island with a friend. So we went to the Shrine of Pen Malanga first, and then
Yeah,
we walked along the Llyn Peninsula, which is the top peninsula in Wales, and it's an ancient medieval pilgrimage route
great name.
over some mountains and stuff. And we towards Bardsey Island, which was an island where a lot of saints ended up. Now,
Yeah,
um, when I got to a point, I mean, I'm not that physically fit, and I was less so then because I wasn't used to this. And I got to the point after 3 days of walking that I just couldn't walk anymore. And we've been walking for 3 days. I've been with my friend, so I said, "Look, mate, you go on. I'm here. Like this is it." And I just lay down by the side of the road, and right now having walked Camino and other pilgrimages since, I realized that you recover from that. But back then, I didn't know that. So back then, I literally thought the energy had run out, and that was it. I couldn't go further. On Camino, I've had that feeling, and then after half an hour lying down, you're better, and you can go on another mile or so. Okay, but I didn't know that then, and I think that's important. So literally, the place where I stopped, it was a no place. It was a place between places. It was literally a kink in a road, and there was a farm gate, and the road was unnamed. It was the middle of nowhere. And my mate walked off, and I lay there completely, utterly shattered. And then I began to notice things. So I began to notice there was a grasshopper chirping in the grass, and I began to notice the grass and the flowers and everything. Now, that doesn't sound like anything, but it
Well, it kind of does.
it was like, and this is the problem with religious experience. You can't always put it into words, but it
Mhm.
was like as if everything was transfigured. And what I realized, I'd seen millions of blades of grass and millions of flowers over the last few days, and I hadn't noticed any of them. And yet now I was noticing each and every one, and I was overcome by how beautiful they were. And the nearest example I can think of is, like some people say when they take certain drugs like LSD or mushrooms and stuff, that like your perceptions get heightened.
Yeah.
So, the glass on a bottle feels incredibly smooth in a way you can't describe it. Like it was almost like that. And I just felt this infusion of joy and at creation and the beauty of everything. And I call it my Franciscan experience. And I literally stood up in the middle of that road and started dancing. And remember, I was shattered and started dancing and singing Brother Sun, Sister Moon. And I wanted to outpour all this great, great joy.
Wow.
And and I was doing that for half an hour, and I'd never felt anything like it before.
Well, that's a fantastic story, Matt. And, I do think I know what you're talking about. And I think there are going to be a lot of people who hear this who can actually relate to that
Mm.
experience if they have done what you've done, walked in places that we consider
Mhm.
sacred, even if we visited them without necessarily having set out on a pilgrimage per se. Many people will attest to these kinds of experiences in certain places.
Mhm.
And, maybe if you're reflecting on a certain mindset, or, they used to, there's I think this is entirely possible. The oracles of old, which would simply answer the question that you had, or the fairy hills where you could go to have a question answered. And I think when we ponder these things, we can be these very surprising, supernatural, mystical
Mhm.
experience can absolutely occur.
I mean,
And
I don't want to say like because I am a bit of a skeptic naturally, but I experienced. So it could be supernatural. It could be a result of expending all that energy and focusing all your thoughts for so long. But I don't care the result is the same. And it was a love of the world. And it was a love and it was something you cannot experience, I think, in normal life. Now, I have had similar ones, say when I was on Camino. I remember one night I just sat in this albergue and after a hard day's walking and that, and then watched all these swallows flying. And I literally burst into tears watching these swallows flying around, which was of course very similar. But and I think maybe it's a bit of both. Maybe because let's be honest, you can expend all that energy and do all that spiritual and that mental effort and not get this. So I don't think it's just that. I think it's a bit of both. I think if you don't put any effort in, you won't get anything out. But at the same time, just because you put the effort in, it doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, if I walk 25 kilometers today, then boom, it's going to happen. No.
right, oh no, of course not.
And I think that's like religion isn't transactional in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's the part of the charm almost, is you can't, it is supernatural, and we don't have any control over when or how or why or
Mm-hmm.
if, as you said.
But what I wanted to say as well, and I realize I'm hogging the conversation here a bit, but
No, no, not at all. I really, I haven't actually been on a pilgrimage, so
and I'm not saying
you're our expert in these conversations, Matt.
but I'm not saying you have. I mean, look, you can have religious experiences not on pilgrimage, right? But
Yes, of course, I
why
have, absolutely.
yeah, why I think you get them on pilgrimage or you get them more often is because you've put that effort in, is because I think walking is a form of meditation. So you put the
Absolutely.
prep work in. Um, and so
Well, and I think also, if I could, I think the fact that you've removed yourself from, as you said, you can't do this in everyday life. Well, you can, of course you can. It can happen, and there's no control, like I said. However, I think if you've taken yourself out of your everyday life, routine, comfort, everything that you've used to, I do think that you've opened a door. And yes, you cannot control and, call forth something that isn't gonna
Mm,
happen. However, you can certainly be primed, for an experience, and you have to
yeah.
be in some sort of state of readiness. And you're saying that absolutely, you're even going to maybe possibly want to be on a pilgrimage if you want these kinds of things to occur. So,
Yeah.
um,
And I mean, I guess the best example from, famous religious figures in history is probably the Buddha, who went searching for years, and he only, yeah, and then it was kind of when he'd almost given up, and he sat down under the tree, and boom, his enlightenment came. It's like he couldn't predict when he was coming, but if he hadn't done all that searching, it probably would never have come. Like that's the thing.
yeah,
And
yeah. So that's where people also talk about, and I think this goes across religions and cultures as well, is that still small voice
yes,
of
yes,
God, or however we interpret that which is more than we are.
mhm,
If we're gonna be able to, if we're gonna hear that and observe that, as you said, even being able to observe nature and have literally what you
yeah,
described as a feeling as an ecstatic experience, which has certainly been described by mystics, across
yeah.
time.
And
Uh,
interesting, you said still small voice. That was Elijah after he'd climbed a mountain and was praying in a cave, which is very much the same sort of situation. He climbed up a holy mountain and was praying
yeah.
in,
Well,
he
and the
put the
mountain
effort in.
itself. Yeah, the mountain is also a symbol of
Yeah,
when we go apart alone,
yeah,
higher up, is also very symbolic to receive some kind of message. And where I started out with talking about this was um, the desert mothers and fathers
yeah,
also chose to isolate themselves, from a very early time. And this isn't just in Christianity, but this is what I know about, where
yeah, yeah.
people isolate themselves in order to become more connected, more
Well,
knowledge.
I mean,
There's people
Christ
like Tesla and
started his
Einstein, and
ministry.
what were they, what were they reading from? And
Yeah. Well, I mean, Christ started his ministry by going out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights.
yeah,
So, what I want to do though is talk about something else, right? So, this is not my religious experience, but this is one of a close friend of mine, and I think
okay,
it's relevant because
go.
so a friend of mine, she was quite young at the time. Either her mum was ill or her mum had just died, but it was a bit of a difficult time, and she was praying. She'd actually been looking into I think Islam, and she was praying at night, and she felt a presence on her shoulder, right? And that to her, she says, like it was God, and she felt this kind and comforting, but also, this very definite presence on her shoulder. So that was God, she said, and that was what made her. She converted and became Muslim, right? Okay, and but interestingly, the Muslim thing, she went fairly conservative, not super conservative, but fairly conservative, and it kind of met her needs for a while because she was going through a very difficult time, particularly with her mum dying and that, and it was that tumultuous time in life anyway when we're young. But after a few years, she found that it was quite imprisoning for her, and she wasn't herself. Now,
Mhm.
I think she still technically identifies as Muslim, but she's gone on a journey towards liberality, and so she'll drink and date, and and not segregate herself from men and all that kind of stuff now. But she's still very religious, and she said to me, she says, "But I don't get it." So because if that experience was real, how come it didn't? How come that wasn't for me? Like, how come that solution didn't work for me? And the way I said to her, I said, well, I think your experience was real. I think it
Mhm.
was genuine because at the time where you were, that was probably what you needed. You needed structure, you needed certainty, and you needed a bit of clear direction. The problem is this: everything is temporary. All things must pass. So what is the message for Mary Michelle now might not be the message for Mary Michelle in 5 years' time, or even in 10 years, or
Or
in a
anybody,
year's
sure,
time.
yes.
And so the problem is, I think human beings, we try to make everything black and white and permanent. And so I said that was good for you then, but it wasn't good for you now, because the person in trauma has very different needs than the person who's on an even keel.
Yeah.
And the younger person has very different needs than the older person. And so what you needed, you listened to the still small voice then, but you need to keep listening. And also,
Okay.
the solution for you, just because that was right for you, that does not mean that is right for everybody.
Well, sure. And as you know, if we want to talk about mysticism and spirituality, of course, that those things exist outside of time. You know, time
Mm.
is a construct for us in our culture, so that we know when to get up and go to bed. But it doesn't actually exist. So on that basis, of course, you're absolutely right, Matt. Only what you know, what you're aware of in the moment is
Mm-hmm.
actually relevant,
But
right? At any given time. So
I guess what I'm trying to say, and this is where it relates back to the pilgrimage aspect, is that you like you have the experience, and that's genuine, and I'll accept your experience. But what is equally important is you reflecting on it,
sure, yeah,
because the meaning might not be apparent straight away.
yeah,
And I'll give you a very quick
actually, yeah.
example
I've
before I
had that
shut up.
experience
Is
too.
that one of the most famous mystics in medieval Christian Europe was, well, we don't even know her name, but she's usually referred to as Julian of Norwich, because she was an
Right.
anchoress in St. Julian's Church, and she had these visions when she was quite young, wrote them down, and then
Yeah.
about 30 years later, after reflecting on them for 30 years, wrote a longer version with deeper thought about it.
Yeah. Didn't
And
she
I
have
think that's quite
abilities or
interesting.
something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow. Right?
Mm,
Yes. Well, in those days, yeah. Also, people knew how to wait for things.
yeah. And that's a good thing with pilgrimage, because it gives you that time to reflect.
Good point, Matt. Good point. I agree with you completely. You know, it's not something that's written in stone. You know, I always say as we move towards the horizon, it's not fixed. You know, it's also
Mm,
moving towards us. You know, none of
yeah.
these points are ever fixed, and we just intersect, and then we're at that some
Yeah.
other intersection. So
Yeah.
I love that. And the way you put it when we were starting there, Matt, when you and I were talking, you said, I think this is very important to wrap this with. It's not just about the experience, it's how you reflect on it,
Mm,
which is what you said, Matt. And this is why, yeah, I'm always all over this business of everybody needing more time to reflect.
mm,
And as you said, for those answers to surface, but they sure as heck can't if we're, you know, it's too noisy and we're too
yeah.
busy.
Yeah.
That much I do know.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Still small voice. All about the still small voice.
Yes, yes.
Oh well. Shall we leave
Time.
it there?
Pardon?
Shall we leave it there?
Let's.
Yeah.
That
Well,
was lovely. Thank you, Matt. And I always enjoy your stories so much, you
yeah.
know.
Well,
Your
thank
story,
you. Thank you
your
so much.
stories are my favorite part, especially the one from last week. The one from the cemetery. Absolutely loved it. And I love this week's stories as well. Thank you so much, Matt.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, God bless Mary Michelle.
You too, Matt.
Uncle
What do you
Johnny
say?
Matt,
What did you say? You say?
stay
Keep
on the
on.
path. Stay on the path.
Bye for now.